Welcome, everybody, to this new episode of CCIR Student Spotlight. My name is Oliver, and with me today is Nicholas Ng. Nicholas is a current Year 12 student at the West Island School. During his time at CCIR, he worked with Dr. Hakan Koskan from the Harvard Medical School and ultimately produced a project focused on the assessment of gene therapy for heart cell regeneration in mammals. First things first, Nicholas, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So very quickly, Nicholas, let's begin by, let's say, talking a little bit about how you came to CCIR and how in particular you came to start thinking about doing something like research. So Nicholas, tell us about what you were looking for in a program as you sort of came to CCIR and why in particular you really wanted to start doing research at the high school level.
Okay, yeah. So first things first, why I wanted to come to CCIR. So I was looking for research programs because, first of all, I'm interested in studying medicine. So I thought that this would be really useful in helping me sort of gain more insight into medical knowledge because research is a big part of medicine and science. And obviously, this would also help with my university because there would be research being done in university as well. And this would also help my application to university, of course. And I chose CCR because I thought it was interesting that there was a chance for a one-on-one mentorship because this was quite unique and sort of being able to work closely with a professor that's kind of an expert in the field of your choosing or your interest would be extremely helpful and would help you produce kind of like a good research paper. And also you would learn a lot on the way. So yeah, that's why I chose CCIR and specifically the one-on-one mentorship program.
So ultimately, you ended up getting matched with Dr. Hakan Koskan, who's a current faculty member at the Harvard Medical School. Really sort of fancy pedigree that Hakan has. But Hakan really is one of our more, let's say, amicable and approachable mentors, ultimately, actually. So tell me a little bit about the initial process of calibrating your interests. So as a high school student, typically your research interests coming into the program are going to be a little bit more general, a little bit more diffuse, but especially for someone who is working at Hakan's level, things are going to be really specialized. So tell me a little bit about the initial process of sort of exploring which direction of research you wanted to go in was like.
Yeah, so first of all, I suppose I'm quite interested in cardiology, sort of as a field, like the heart specifically, I suppose. And I also read up on Dr. Koskin before the program, and he's also specializing in sort of research in cardiology. So I did look into some of his work, and it's kind of on gene therapy and congenital heart disease and that kind of thing. So I was quite interested in that. And when we first started, we looked at heart disease in adults, and then we looked for potential treatment options. We also did kind of look at perhaps children and heart problems, but in the end, we kind of settled on sort of gene therapy specifically as a treatment method for heart cell regeneration for patients with heart failure, because we wanted to be more sort of broad instead of being it's so focused, but also remaining in the field of cardiology because it's something that sort of Professor Dr. Koskin is an expert in and something that I'm interested in.
And tell me a little bit more about how it came to be that you became interested in cardiology in particular. So what was it about this particular subfield of medicine that captured you?
Right, yeah. So basically, I think the heart, it's always fascinated me ever since I started studying biology in year 10. So when we first started the heart, I just thought it was really interesting that this kind of organ that's just like the size of your fist is kind of responsible for pumping all the blood to the rest of your body. And because I run a lot, so kind of the heart is key to running as a sport. So because you train up your cardiovascular fitness through running, and that's sort of like the key to your success, if you will, as a runner. So that kind of also sparked my interest in the heart because of my personal interest in sports as well as just sort of the biology and how the heart works in general.
Mm-hmm. Great. So one question I want to quickly press you on right now is before I get to that one, actually, Nicholas, have you done research before coming to CCIR?
No, I hadn't. So this was my first time doing research.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent. So the question I want to ask you is, in your time at CCIR and the sort of specific learning style that you got, um, in your particular case, you went to the one-on-one mentorship program, which meant that you were working really closely and in a one-on-one capacity with a faculty mentor on a specific project directly. So tell
Yeah.
me a little bit about let's say, the differences between this way of approaching science and learning science, and maybe what the way of learning science that you're more familiar with looks like in high school. What were some of the sort of difficulties that you experienced in the differences between these two ways of teaching and learning?
Right. So I suppose the main difference is obviously in high school, there's quite a large class of people. And so you don't get as much of the teacher's attention, or like you won't have as much time one on one with the teacher, if any at all, to be honest, because, the teacher would be always busy with the entire class and can't be focused on like the one student. So, kind of the reason why I wanted to do the one on one was because I thought it would give it like a completely different experience to learning because through working with Dr. Koskin one on one, I was able to kind of get a lot more personalized sort of way of learning
Mhm.
and being able to sort of work to my strengths as well and being able to kind of like make up for my weaknesses if that makes sense because being able to just ask more questions with Dr. Koskin and just him being able to help me with kind of every sort of little question that I had was really useful. Um, as for the difficulties, I honestly don't think there were major difficulties in sort of changing to this style because I think it suits me quite well, being able to work sort of closely with someone because I appreciate the like the close communication and just being able to ask more questions because I had a lot of questions to ask.
Mhm. That's really
Yeah.
great. Tell me, I guess, if you can expand on one particular difference is writing the research paper, because I've read your research paper. It really is going to look quite different, I imagine, from anything else you've written at the high school level. So tell me a little bit about the differences you encountered in writing these two types of papers, and what it was that struck you in working in particular on a research paper.
Right. So I suppose in high school, the main sort of papers that we work on would be essays and kind of for language subjects or literature like English instead of scientific essays, if you will. And even if we are writing like a paper for science, it's normally like a lab report on actual experiments that we did instead of a review article on something that we're interested in. So I think being able to like it's quite difficult to transition from that to writing a scientific paper because it's like a completely different style of writing. And you have to be aware of so many different things like references and structuring it completely differently and sort of like making sure that you have the right diagrams or whether you need diagrams or not and things like that. So it was quite difficult for me at first actually um,
Mhm.
to be able to write because I didn't know how to write a review article or scientific paper at all. So yeah.
Yeah, and I guess tell me a little bit about, so these are the difficulties that I guess I'm really interested in. Tell me about how eventually you learned to overcome those particular difficulties. So you said it was very difficult at first. What sort of got you on your feet eventually?
I think Dr. Koskin gave me a few sort of review articles on similar topics to read through. And so reading through those gave me a really good idea of how to structure them, like the general structure of it and the wording and sort of the language that you're supposed to use and the detail that you're supposed to include. Because, yeah.
Excellent. So um, a lot of prospective students will be watching these sorts of videos. So it's always useful, I think, for students who have traveled this path to share a little bit of their own wisdom and how they actually manage to find their footing in what is an extremely sort of challenging new academic environment. So I want to quickly transition now and talk a little bit more specifically about your project. So earlier, I announced the title of your project, which is the Assessment of Gene Therapy for Heart Cell Regeneration in Mammals. So maybe, Nicholas, you can give us a quick snapshot in layman's terms of what roughly gene therapy can do for heart cell regeneration. Give us a quick picture. What are we looking at here?
Right. So in sort of the main idea is that when you're a baby and you're growing inside like your mother's womb, your cells have the potential to sort of replicate and regenerate by themselves, if you will, I suppose. But when you sort of leave the womb and you grow up, your cells lose this ability, and that's why people with heart failure are unable to regrow the damaged part of tissue, and that's why it's permanent and such a big problem in healthcare, because there's not really a way to replace these damaged cells. And so gene therapy aims to restart this process or cell cycle, which is what it's called, so that these heart cells will regenerate and become sort of form new healthy cells to replace the ones that were damaged and can no longer be properly functioning. Yeah.
So just so I understand, Nicholas, as someone who doesn't have a science background and hasn't worked with Dr. Koskin for 14 weeks, so what we're able to do then with gene therapy is in adults activate the same sort of regenerative procedures that would be available in infants, sort of at a later stage of development. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So through gene therapy, you can alter many different protein levels and all of these things in order to restart the cell cycle. But there are many different ways of to get there, but it's all under like the broad spectrum of gene therapy. So you're altering the cells to make them regenerate, essentially. It's like, yeah.
Can you give a cartoon example of how this might work? It doesn't have to be sort of in depth with all the science and all the alphabet soup, but what's sort of a cartoon example of how gene therapy would be able, for instance, to function?
Right. So you would have something called a vector, which transports your selected, say you're using a gene and you want to replace an existing gene inside the adult cell so that it would regenerate. And so you use this vector or transporter, as it's, if you would like to think of it that way. And you sort of insert this particular gene into the genetic information of that adult cell. And so that sort of alteration would cause it to return to its ability, like regain its ability to re-enter the cell cycle and so regenerate itself. So that's one way of doing it. There are many different other ways. So like transcription factors and microRNAs, all that.
I won't press you on sort of the technical details because I imagine that's also not what most of the listeners are going to be mostly interested in. I guess one thing I want to hear from you about is in diving really in depth into this new field of medical technology and looking at gene therapy in sort of high levels of detail. Was there anything that you learned about this field that really sort of knocked you off your feet, that really surprised you, and that really sort of gripped your interest in this sort of emerging technology?
Yeah, I think sort of genetic therapy and genes as a form of therapeutic treatment is it's an extremely new kind of form of potential treatment, but at the same time, it seems to be quite unpredictable and not much is known about it, to be honest. And I think it's really interesting that sort of being able to alter your genetic information in order to sort of treat a disease is quite interesting, because that basically means you're changing your cells to change your damaged cells, if you know what I
Mhm. Yeah. So in the title of your research paper, you say it's the assessment of gene therapy for heart cell regeneration in mammals. Can you tell me a little bit about roughly what the assessment ended up being? So what were you assessing, and what was sort of your judgment when it came to how you assessed the state of the art of gene therapy right now?
Right. So most of the assessment, like that was done in the evaluation or discussion part. So after explaining, so like explaining kind of how it works and everything. So essentially, we looked at other forms of treatment as well as like new forms of treatment. Um, yeah, and also we looked at current studies that use gene therapy and kind of the success or impact that they had on the test subjects, because they were both kind of clinical and non-clinical, so they use animals to test it on. And we found that there were many limitations to gene therapy as an avenue of treatment, because, as I said, most of the testing is being done on animal subjects, so uh, you can't really know whether it would work on humans. And as well as just the whole subject of gene therapy, it's so new that not many people know much about it and whether it actually works or not in practice. Um, because the clinical trials showed um, very little benefit to the subjects, if you will. So yeah,
Okay.
and so
Um,
yeah, so that's how we kind of we explained what gene therapy could potentially be, but then we also evaluated why right now we're not at that stage yet.
hmm. So it sounds like part of what you guys ended up doing for this particular paper is deflating a little bit of the hype around gene therapy. Does that sound like a correct
Yeah,
assessment of where you guys
yeah,
landed here?
that's yeah. I think it's important to kind of remain realistic about gene therapy, as much potential as it may have, because right now we may just don't have the knowledge or the resources to know everything about it, or
Hmm.
everything that we need to know about it for it to be effective.
Hmm. And I guess this research in some ways feeds back on yourself as well, because I imagine part of the reason why you chose this particular subject to begin with, to begin your sort of lit review, was because you saw this incredibly exciting new technology. Has that changed after all of this research? Are you less excited about gene therapy, or are you simply, let's say, more realistically excited about gene therapy?
I wouldn't say I'm less excited about gene therapy as a potential treatment method, but this 14 weeks has made me more aware of the problems of gene therapy, and more broadly speaking, any type of new therapeutic method that's coming out, because um, there's just so little experience with it, and there's just not enough testing. There's not enough knowledge or resources to know what we need to know about it. So it has a lot of potential, but that potential takes a lot of time and effort to sort of to get, I suppose.
And I wonder how, just one quick follow up on this particular question. I wonder how this has changed maybe your perception of, let's say, popular science and popular sort of media around science, because every once in a while you do hear, breakthrough technology in gene therapy is going to change everything in 5 years or something like that. That's a really, really popular refrain. Has this experience of really sort of digging down deep into the science and into the research change your understanding of how medicine works and how science works?
Yeah, I think in the process of developing new treatment, there's just so much testing that needs to be done and so much information that has to be found out that there's no way something can completely change sort of treatment or like the pathology of like a disease in such a short period of time. Like it would take like an extremely long period of time for it to completely be clinically effective and sort of widespread, I suppose.
Mhm. Yeah, so it sounds like in the course of your time with Dr. Koskan, you not only sort of figured out and developed a whole bunch of new research skills, you also really sort of gained a deeper understanding of um, medical technology, treatment, as well as how scientific research actually proceeds. What I want to ask you right now, Nicholas, is a question that I ask almost all the interviews I do for Student Spotlight. And it's a question I usually like to close out the interview with. And the question is just this. Research, especially at CCIR, is really quite an intensive and rigorous experience. You've come the whole way through. You've experienced the difficulties of writing a research paper, figuring out what to do, narrowing down your subject. All of this can seem really quite daunting and a little bit scary even for prospective students. In your experience, Nicholas, what would you tell a prospective student who is considering research, but a little bit daunted by research, of why they should or maybe should not do research?
Yeah, I think first of all, research is a really time consuming process. Like you have to read through so many different sources, so many different papers, studies, data, all of that. But at the end of the day, if it's something that you're interested in, it doesn't feel that difficult because as you read more, you learn more about that topic that you chose that you're personally interested in. So I think I wouldn't say it's tedious at all, to be honest. I would say it's quite enjoyable to be doing research and learning more about this topic that you've chosen. And as for sort of writing the paper itself, it's definitely challenging at first, but once you get more exposure to these kind of scientific papers and with the help of your mentor, um, yeah, you get the hang of it pretty quickly, honestly, and it becomes quite an enjoyable experience to just write and read and learn.
Yeah, and it is worth saying, Nicholas, that just half an hour ago, as you told me earlier before the call started, you just got a journal acceptance. So it really does sound like you came a long way throughout your journey, and you got quite a lot out of this experience here. So with all of that, Nicholas, I just want to say thank you so much for your time on this podcast today. It was a pleasure having you, and I wish you best of luck in all of your future intellectual and academic endeavors. Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you. Thank you.